Actung, Actung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, James Holland, and today I'm joined once again by Des Curtis, who we're reconvening because there was so much to say, Des, last time about your time as a navigator on a Mosquito, well, and before that on a Beaufighter in the Second World War, that we needed to come back for a second dose. Where we got to was you were training for the operations against the Tirpitz and wondering how on earth you were ever going to sort of get out of that alive if the operation went ahead. And then we kind of sort of ran out of time. So at what point did that operation did you learn that operation wasn't going to go ahead?
That was in the end of August of 1943, when it was quite obvious that the weapon wasn't going to perform properly. The target was too far away, and because 617 were now shown to be a more potent force, the emphasis then moved away from the high ball bouncing bomb towards the heavier weapon to have to be dropped from a greater height than we were going to operate. I think many people were relieved at high level that they wouldn't be responsible for the loss of a squadron of aircraft had they gone ahead with that attack.
Can you remember was there a day where you were suddenly sort of called in and told, okay, this is going to be, it's all off? I mean, how were you informed that it wouldn't be going ahead?
Simply, they said, for the time being, the squadron is going to be disbanded because further research is needed on the weapon itself and its performance. So the squadron is going to be disbanded, and then when necessary, it will be reformed. In the meantime, you'll be posted away to other units.
And could you remember your reaction to that? I mean, but you must have been pretty relieved, weren't you?
No, of course, total relief.
Yeah.
Apart from the relief that we're going to survive for another day, just getting away from being cooped up from April until August in almost total isolation was starting to take its toll.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So any excuse to do anything different, get away from that place.
So where were you posted to?
I was posted to RAF Benson to 540 PRU Squadron.
And were you happy about that? Was that all right? I mean, did you have any choice in the matter, or was it just...
I don't have a choice. We volunteered to do that. This is where you're going.
Right.
No, going to Benson was quite interesting because we had never been up to these astronomical heights of 25,000 feet and above.
Right.
And when we went there, we were told that we were going to pick up a relatively new PRU aircraft and do a line overlap right down the Italian coast, a line overlap photography right down the Italian west coast, and then fly on to Egypt, where we would hand over the aircraft and work our way back to England. A very attractive proposition, going to Egypt for a little while and then taking your time to come back to England. All seemed quite attractive. And we saw this lovely, highly polished blue Mosquito sitting there, and that's the aircraft that you're going to fly.
Right.
So we took it up to 32,000 feet and flew out across to Bristol and out onto the Irish Sea. They didn't tell us that at about 22,000 feet there would be a monumental bang because the superchargers came in, but we didn't have pilot's notes or anything. But
did you not? That's amazing.
On our way back, we came down through cloud to come back to Benson and did a spiral descent through cloud. And unknown to us, a flying fortress formation was going out on a daylight raid. And as we came through cloud, we saw these fortresses on either side of us as we spiraled through, which was a rather frightening sight. However, and then we went on leave, had some jabs, came back and said, you shouldn't be here. You should be in Prydanig. Where's Prydanig? Down in Cornwall. As it happened, there was an aircraft coming in from Shawbury down to Benson on some, I don't know why it was there, on Oxford. And we said, can you give us a lift down to Bredannock, wherever that is? So we up sticks and went to Bredannock.
Well, it must be quite nice being in Cornwall, wasn't it?
Delightful, in a hotel on the cliff edge.
Oh, really? Amazing.
And the beaches were still accessible at that time.
Were they?
In that part of the world, unlike the East Coast where the beaches were closed off. So that was our start of 618 Special Detachment.
618 Special Detachment.
Yes.
Wow. And so so when did 618, did it reconvene as a squadron?
Not as a squadron. 618 reconvened at Beccles in Norfolk, because by that time they had the Air Ministry had decided that the squadron should move out to Australia,
right,
and to then take part in the attacks on Japan. And fortunately, we weren't recruited because we were operational by then, but the rest of the squadron were brought back in and taught to fly as if they were flying off aircraft carriers. Beccles runway was marked off aircraft carrier deck length, and they practiced deck landings there in preparation for heading out to Australia on 2 aircraft carriers.
So did you remain as the 618 detachment? Was that remained your name?
No, we stayed as 618 Special Detachment.
Yeah.
Under the administrative rule of 248 Squadron, because we were only four crews, plus ground crew. And then later on, once the secrecy of the weapon became less important, we were then merged into 248 Squadron and became Sea Flight of 248 Squadron.
Got you.
They were then, by then, had re-equipped from Beaufighters to Mark 6 Mosquitoes.
Right. And what did you make of the PRU Mosquito?
Beautiful aircraft.
Yeah.
It was a highly polished version, so it looked almost stately.
Was it armed? Presumably not, if it's PRU.
Sorry?
And presumably unarmed if it was
unarmed.
PRU.
Oh, yes.
Goodness me.
Unarmed, just full of cameras. That was all.
So presumably but by this time, this is about September 1943, something like that, is it?
Yes, yeah, yes.
Done your trip to Italy and Egypt and come back again. And so how long are you there at Bredannock?
We went to Bredannock in September 43, and we moved across to Portreath, the other side of Cornwall, I suppose about 3 months later. Right.
Yeah, Portreath is a nice part of the world to be, isn't it?
Both were very pleasant.
And so were you able to get out and enjoy the Cornish, coastline and beaches and bars and whatnot?
The Polurian Hotel, which was the officers' mess, was a lovely 4-star hotel. Fantastic. And we had large bedrooms with three or four of us per bedroom.
Right.
We had the cliff paths were open, and for example, in December when we had the Christmas event, the officers, of course, had to wait on the airmen for the Christmas lunch, which we did.
Yes.
Having had a few jugs before we set off to do that pleasant task.
Yeah.
And then I remember that after coming back to the mess, I made my way down to the beach down below, stretched out on the beach on Christmas Day and fell asleep.
Did you really?
Fighting a hard war.
Well, I felt, having heard what you've done up to that point, I think you probably earned that 1 day of relaxation, to be honest, Des. So how often would you be flying in a typical week? Did it just depend? Or you wouldn't be flying every single day, would you?
No, there was no pattern of flying at all because partly we were waiting till targets were identified,
Right.
which wasn't a daily occurrence. We were very weather susceptible.
Mm-hmm.
We could take off in night time, but we had no night flying fighter capability because of the flash from the gun. So the gun really only was usable during daylight hours.
Got you.
So that limited the number of hours of the day that we could operate. So there were times when we would go for maybe 2 weeks without any operational flying.
Right.
And because we had fewer aircraft, sometimes we only had 2 aircraft available to us. We would sometimes use one of the Mark 6 aircraft
Mm-hmm.
to get some practice in, to get some flying practice in, just to keep our skills highly polished, yes.
Presumably, at Portreif, you're with 248 Squadron, you're back with Coastal Command, is that correct?
Right the way through, yes. Yeah.
And so what most of the work you're doing, I mean, obviously you're no longer going down the Italian coast taking photographs. Is it anti-submarine work that's your primary role?
Yes, yeah. Initially, when we first acquired the Mark 18,
mm-hmm.
we were engaged solely in attacking U-boats close into their pens.
Right.
Once the weapon became quite obvious to the Germans that there was a different type of weapon that was neither a bomb nor a machine gun, then the need for security diminished a bit, and we were then allowed to attack surface craft as well as U-boats, which extended our capability and our success rate enormously, of course.
Yeah. So were most of your operations out over kind of sort of towards northern France, the Bay of Biscay, that kind of thing?
Entirely Bay of Biscay initially.
Right.
Until France was cleared by the Germans, then we moved back up from there, back up to Scotland again to continue our work against the Norwegian coast.
Okay. So Des, when you were first down in Cornwall, you were on the Mark 6s. When did the Mark 18s come in?
No, we started only with the Mark 18. Mark 6s were going to 248 Squadron.
Right.
And 248 Squadron provided the fighter escorts that we needed.
Got you.
Once we completed 2 operations, then we realized that we needed to have fighter escorts, which was provided by 248. Usually 4 aircraft, but then as the Germans became more aware of what was going on, we needed 6 aircraft to accompany us to attack the surface vessels that were accompanying the U-boats.
Right. So you were doing just so I'm absolutely clear on this. So you were doing the photographic work, but the escort were doing the shooting up if necessary.
No, correction. We weren't doing photographic work. That finished when I left Benson.
Got you.
The photographic work was a handheld camera.
Right.
That I could hold for a few seconds, and I did manage to get one picture when we were attacked U-976.
Right. So you're attacking aircraft, and then the escort is there so that you can concentrate on doing the attacking of vessels, whether they be U-boats or whether they be surface vessels, and the escort behind you are sort of watching your back. Is that how it worked?
Their job was to attack the minesweepers and destroyers that were out in the mineswept channels of the Bay of Biscay. Their job to escort the U-boats in and out of harbour, U-boat pens.
Right.
Because there was a narrow series of channels that were mineswept by the Germans, through which the U-boats had to pass.
Right.
So our escorts then were tasked to douse the flak of the minesweepers and the destroyers.
Got you.
Later on, to fight with the Ju-88s that were given fighter cover by the Germans.
Right.
As the defences became stronger. They included a ship called a sparbreaker, which was a merchant ship with the decks cleared completely, and they were equipped solely with anti-aircraft guns. So they became a floating anti-aircraft battery. They were added then to the defences, which made a formidable range of defences go against our 2 aircraft and 6 escorts.
So your task is to concentrate on the U-boat while the escort concentrate on everything else.
Yeah, protecting us. Yeah.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back shortly. See you in a moment. Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk.
And a Mark 18, I mean, that sounds absolutely fearsome. I mean, it's with that 57 millimeter cannon and machine guns and all the rest of them. 4 machine guns, I think. Is that right?
Initially 4, and we cut it back to 2.
Right. But that cannon, Des, I mean, that's quite a thing, isn't it?
It's a massive piece of airborne artillery, 12.5 foot long.
Yeah.
Tucked away on offset from the centre line of the fuselage, offset slightly to starboard, right, to make room for the cartridge shell, which was some 20 odd inches long, to fall out of the aircraft safely without damaging the tailplane.
Right.
And we had armour-plated engines. Each engine was armour-plated, and the underside of our cockpit was armour-plated. So we were an unusually heavy version of a Mosquito. And there was enough space when they fitted the gun. There was enough space at the breech of the gun between there and the next bulkhead to squeeze in another small tank. So we had another reserve tank in addition to the wing tanks. We had wing tanks permanently fitted onto the aircraft. So we were a heavyweight Mosquito, much heavier than Mark 6.
And presumably that has an impact on how it flies. Its maneuverability, its speed, and all sorts of things.
Well, they had to install a Mark 25 Merlin engine, which was a more powerful engine.
Yep.
And there was a speed limitation, really, because with that all-up weight, the recommended flying rate was 280 miles an hour, which was slightly lower than we'd normally expect for a Mark 6 aircraft.
Sure.
So it was a heavily defended aircraft in that sense of being armour-plated.
Yeah.
I had sat on an armour-plated sheet steel was my chair.
Right. But what did you make of it? I mean, were you a bit daunted that suddenly, you having been operating in an incredibly quick and highly maneuverable and lightweight aircraft version of the Mosquito, suddenly you've got this kind of heavier, slightly more cumbersome beast that you're controlling?
Well, you had to get used to this firing of this gun, which was quite an unusual activity.
Well,
because the noise and the jolting of the aircraft, there was something to be believed, because you had the noise of the gun firing, then you had the noise of the breech opening and another round being inserted into the breech, and the breech block closing before the second round was fired. So during that stage was taking place, there was a very noisy aircraft. And of course, when the gun was fired, the flame from the gun was measured. We had a photographic Union aircraft flew alongside us on one occasion while we fired the gun, and they measured the flame at 123-foot flame.
Good.
Came from the muzzle of the gun below us. So we were flying into our own flame.
Oh, my goodness.
The aircraft, in fact, came to a standstill for a microsecond because the recoil on that gun was really quite something, about 9,600 pounds. And the buffer that took the recoil had to be cleaned every day, whether the aircraft was in use or not, because that was an important part. If that recoil was not operating satisfactory, the gun wouldn't work.
And so when you were first equipped with these, I mean, how much sort of training did you have before you went on your first operations, or was it just sort of get in and off you go and work it out yourself?
About 40 minutes.
It's just amazing, isn't it?
Take it out over the sea, make sure that there were no ships around, and say, let's see what happens. Press the tit and see what happens.
Wow. I mean, I just can't really imagine what it must have been like being in a Mosquito, firing a gun of that size on a largely wooden plane. I mean, even one that's got armor plate. It just seems just not what the plane's designed to do, and yet incredibly, because of its extraordinary versatility, John, it seemed to work.
James, it came to a matter of faith.
Yeah,
we had total faith in the viability of the aircraft. The aircraft was strong.
Yeah,
we knew it was strong. We knew it was up to the task. When you had that much confidence in the aircraft, then your forward thinking became much more concentrated, because you didn't have to worry as to whether the aircraft would let you down in any way.
Of all the sort of sorties you're going on, how often are you actually able to kind of pick up a U-boat and attack it?
Very infrequently, because the intelligence of signals intercepted by U-boats' arrival at the seaward side of the Mineswept Channel, the intelligence then was fairly meager. You had to pick up that signal. And we got that information, then we had to make sure that we were at the very point, because if we weren't at the point of seaward point where the U-boat was starting its run on the surface, last 30 miles into the U-boat pen, if we were 2 miles away, we might as well be 25 miles away, because we would have been detected, and the U-boat then, all it had to do was, if it couldn't meet up with its surface vessels, was submerged for the time being until we disappeared again.
Sure.
So navigational accuracy was very important from that point of view. So you're flying for 1.5, 2 hours over the sea, out of sight of land at low level, to hit within a half a mile of a stated position.
Yeah. And when you say low level, how low level?
Well, and finally, when you were, for example, going around Ushant, which is the most westerly point of the Bay of Biscay, Germans had a radar station there. So we'd come down to about 30 feet if we had to stay close in, because the further west we were out into the Atlantic, we were wasting time.
Right.
Because once we'd come down from Cornwall due south, we'd then have to turn towards the Bay of Biscay, the French coast. So we turn left after Ushant. So we're down to about 30 feet there.
Crikey.
Very exhilarating, because the sea passed by very quickly.
You can well imagine. I mean, it's amazing to think what you were doing, really.
Once we realized ahead, you saw some ships on the horizon.
Right.
You lifted up, make sure that what you'd seen was real.
Yeah.
And if then, as happened, say, when we attacked on the 25th of March, take that as an example, we saw the outline of some ships on the horizon, pull up to 500 feet.
Right.
Realized that there was a U-boat there. So the two of us, Tetsi aircraft, we would then pull away from our formation. We'd climb up into the sun to attack from out of the sun, and climb up to about 1,500 or 1,600 feet.
Right.
While the fighter escorts then flew straight down onto the target area, and they would start opening fire while we were repositioning 1,600 feet above.
Right.
And so we'd have to be aware that we had our own aircraft somewhere below us. What would then happen is that we would then turn towards the target.
Yes.
And the minute the target, the U-boat, disappeared out of sight below our nose, put the aircraft into a 30-degree dive, open up the throttles to almost full speed, and point the aircraft at your aiming point. And the aiming point was not at the U-boat; it was in the sea to one side of the U-boat.
Right.
So, and in the flight between the 1,500 feet down to a safe breakaway point, which would be maybe 300 feet, accelerating up to nearly 400 miles an hour by then.
Goodness.
Get 5 shots in if you were lucky before you had to break away. And why we aimed at the sea and not at the U-boat was we would attack at a slight angle, not directly at 90 degrees, but a slight angle. And as the solid shell hit the water pressure would cause the shell to change its direction into a curve. The upward pressure would cause the shell to run parallel to the sea at a level that would penetrate the ballast tanks of the U-boat. If it penetrated the ballast tanks, it would then penetrate the hull of the U-boat, which was the ballast tanks on the outside, the hull on the inside, would go into there, still going with full velocity, solid steel shell, and it would then ricochet within the U-boat, particularly if it had hit an engine block, it would ricochet and spin. And if it had enough momentum, it would then possibly find its way out of the U-boat, making a second hole. And again, staying with U-976 as an example, we managed to get 5 shots off at Hilliard, who was flying immediately behind us. He also managed to get 4 shots at it. And when we saw the wreck of the U-boat, the film of the wreck of the U-boat later, there were holes in a vertical line, and they're sufficiently large in themselves to cause the U-boat to break its back as it sank down to the bottom of the sea. And that was how a U-boat was effectively destroyed. If you couldn't destroy it, if you only took the conning tower out of action, U-boat had to then find its way back to U-boat pen. It would be out of action for maybe 2 or 3 months at least, as happened on the 7th of June, for example, 2 days after the invasion started. We were flying towards Cherbourg, and 2 of us without any fighter escort. And a U-boat surfaced immediately below us, extraordinarily. And we watched as German sailor opened the hatch, climbed, and we by then turned around and started an attack. We managed to put enough damage to cause that U-boat to crawl to Lorient.
Right.
It was out of action from June until September.
Presumably there's so much going on and so much to think about at that time. I mean, are you able to kind of sort of focus your thoughts and concentration on the job in hand, or are you thinking, crikey, this is a little bit hairy here?
No, your thoughts were, first of all, on the target. Right. That was the pilot's job. The pilot was the only one who had any control over that. My job then was to make sure I was looking around all the time at any other of our aircraft that we might be putting in danger because of the way we were flying. So I had to be alert to all of that.
Yeah.
And that concentrated the mind completely. There was no other thoughts in your mind as to get that attack completed as best you're able.
Right.
Watching your back end, because if you had Ju-88s coming at you, you also had to watch out for them.
Yeah, sure.
It was a period of just intense concentration.
Yep.
And then once the attack was complete, then you start breathing normally again and make your homeway. We had an amusing incident. We went out on one occasion late evening, and by the time we'd completed our trip down into the bay, it was dark. So I decided as navigator that we'd take a shortcut home. And instead of flying right round Ushant, we would cross over the mainland and come out on the other side of Brest. And that would cut off quite a bit of our journey. So we were flying along in the dark, and suddenly we saw the nav lights of an aircraft ahead of us, realized that was an aircraft that was heading towards an airfield. And unthinking, my pilot decided that we'd have a go at this. So we got up behind it. We had, of course, had our nav lights off, so we were unknown in the dark. And we got up behind this whatever aircraft it was, because we had no idea. We just saw the lights of it. And Doug fired one round, and of course the flash from that blinded him.
Oh, God.
So for about 20 seconds, we were really true flying blind.
Oh, my goodness.
So we decided on the way back, once he got his sight back again, we decided that we wouldn't make any reference to that in our report, because it didn't look too good on our performance chart.
Wow. But you managed to get back safely, obviously. So
sure, yes, yeah.
So with the U-976, this attack on the 25th of March, 1944. I mean, did you have any concept at all that you had hit it and destroyed it?
Well, we thought we'd had a pretty good chance of that, because we had seen brown oil coming out which was obviously diesel, coming out onto the surface. The U-boat had stopped completely. It was totally inert in the water. And we'd started to see some of the crew climbing out onto through the conning tower. So we said, well, he's not going anywhere. And we learned a few days later that, in fact, it had in fact sunk.
Wow. Because you got to know the captain, didn't you, after the war?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, how did that come about?
It came about because another navigator from another squadron had found out that in Cuxhaven there was a German archivist who kept some very detailed records of German U-boat crews and their activities. And this chap got in touch with the archivist, who was quite willing to give us any information within sensible limits. So I wrote to this archivist and said, did he know anything about the captain and crew of U-976? And he wrote back and said, yes, the captain is Captain Raymond Teasler, Commandant Raymond Teasler, who is a personal friend. If you wish to get in touch with him, you must send an open letter through me, so that he could satisfy himself that I wasn't being insulting or in any way offensive. And if that was the case, the letter was okay, he would make sure it got to Raymond Teasler, which happened. And it took me a month to write a letter because I don't speak any German. I could order a beer, but nothing else German. And you can't start off saying, years ago I tried to kill you. And
No.
You can't write that letter. So I wrote the letter. It was delivered to him. And weeks later, I got a reply apologizing it had taken so long to reply because he'd been in hospital without his hips. Both hips had to be removed and replaced simultaneously because he'd been very badly injured during a bombing raid in Nantes some time before, and it all caught up with him. But eventually, my wife and I went out to Herdecker on the Ruhr where he lived. We corresponded and realized that correspondence was healthy. Went there summer's afternoon, wondered what we were going to find, couldn't find the front entrance to the house that he lived in, because it didn't have a front entrance, it was round the back in the garden. So my wife said, well, you go on in, I'm not going to go in with you, just because I don't know what's going to happen here. And there was this chap sitting in the garden. So I called out, I'm looking for her, Raymond Tiesler, and the voice says, it is I. And I went forward and he stood up and we threw our arms around each other.
How amazing.
Unrehearsed. We just took one look, and I can still remember it very clearly. When we finished hugging, he pulled back and he said in perfectly good English, I like what I see.
Oh.
His wife had been standing at the window watching this because she wondered how these two fellows would get on. And that became the beginning of a very good but sadly short friendship with him. At the point that he and his family came to visit us, stay with us in Wimborne in Dorset. We invited them over to the Mosquito Museum. We had celebration events there. When I published my book, they came over for that because I gave the proceeds of the sale of the first edition of my book. I gave all that to the RAF Benevolent Fund. So had Roger Palin, Air Chief Marshal Palin, came up to receive the money. He met the German crews. John Cunningham met the German crews. They were all invited over there.
How wonderful.
And we made good friends out of them. There was only one of the officers that was a pretty offensive character. He couldn't get over the fact that he was German and they were once a mighty nation. But Raymond Tiesler couldn't even abide him. He had to live with him, but he said, I don't like him. I don't like that man. But the rest of them were fine.
Well, it's amazing, isn't it? And that's such an incredibly kind of heartwarming and uplifting story. Des, thank you so much for talking to us today and last time. Thank you very much. And for everyone else, thank you for listening. Cheerio.